the challenge we face is how are we going to respond to an increasingly assertive Russia that is looking to push NATO back, is looking to weaken and damage the NATO alliance. And of course, if we do think about the unthinkable, which is, well, supposing Russia does prevail in the conflict against Ukraine, does anyone seriously think that is the end of Putin's demands that he's going to make to us? Of course it isn't. He is going to take strength from that and deploy that strength somewhere else. And if we really do want to preserve the peace and security and stability of Europe and our democratic values, that does come at a price. I mean, defense and foreign policy haven't featured very strongly in the general election campaign so far, but one thing I'm pretty clear about is that as soon as the election is over, they are going to be pretty prominent and serious issues to be resolved. I think a new government, if there is to be a Labour government, I think probably faces three immediate sort of issues. There's the question about resources, there's the question about strategy, and there's some immediate issues that need to be addressed that really have to be addressed fairly quickly. There's some procurement decisions. There's the issue about continued support for the Ukrainians in the conflict with Russia. And I think that, yes, the public, I think, is following these issues fairly closely. I think we all know that we're living in a different era now. It's not just that conflict is closer to our front door than it's ever been since the end of the First World War. I think that's clear to everyone. But I think for the MOD itself, it's got to speed up its own decision-making processes. I mean, we can't spend 10 to 15 years designing a new main battle tank for the British Army. We can't spend 20 years thinking about our shipbuilding strategy and so on. We've got decisions to make on a much more shorter time fuse because the world is in a much more dangerous place. So I think whoever forms the government, if it's Labour or Conservative, the new Secretary of State for Defence is going to have to hit the ground running with some immediate steps, get the strategy review done as quickly as possible. But there's going to need to be some pretty hard conversations about resources because, you know, if we are going to address some of the shortcomings in our military capability, of which I'm afraid to say there are many, we are going to have a clear decision about what resources are going to be available and how quickly.
Well, you say it's a new era, and I think that's absolutely right. My worry is the new era has shades of the 1930s, when in reality, both Labour and Conservative in that decade were reluctant to do very much about defence spending at all. And although it did start to rise, it was totally inadequate to the need. They seem to be more worried about national debt as we are now. And of course, we know what then happened. The dictators took that as a sign of weakness and went on the march. And John, I would suggest to you, the dictators are back on the march again.
Sadly, you're right. They are back on the march. And I think if we allow history to repeat itself again in this decade, we will rue the day that we did that. So, I mean, it's very difficult, Andrew. I mean, I think no one wants to sort of over-exaggerate the strategic challenges we face, but no one should underestimate them either. And I think at the moment, we've done a lot of analysis, but we've got to come to some decisions about the way forward. I mean, I strongly believe that the MOD will need more resources. I think that the things that have happened to our armed forces in the last 15 years or so really have, as many even Conservative secretaries of state have said, hollowed out our military capability, and we just cannot afford to allow that to continue. We've got to work energetically, I think, to rebuild the capability across the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force to give us a greater credible military deterrent posture, because I'm quite sure that is absolutely at the heart of how we're going to ensure peace and stability in Europe and elsewhere. We are not going to be able to do that on the cheap. That's just not possible. And I think you can talk all day long, as much as you like, about, well, okay, we've got smaller armed forces, but they're more capable. But I think we have to not lose sight of one very basic point, which is that, yes, of course, we need technology, we need capability, but we need a critical mass of people on the ground, at sea and in the air. Because without a critical mass, I'm afraid you can have as much technical capability as you like, but a soldier or a sailor or an airman can only be in one place at any one time. And the challenge we face is, how are we going to respond to an increasingly assertive Russia that is looking to push NATO back, is looking to weaken and damage the NATO alliance? And of course, if we do think about the unthinkable, which is, well, supposing Russia does prevail in the conflict against Ukraine, does anyone seriously think that is the end of Putin's demands that he's going to make to us? Of course it isn't. He is going to take strength from that and deploy that strength somewhere else. And if we really do want to preserve the peace and security and stability of Europe and our democratic values, that does come at a price. At the end of the day, it is actually our soldiers, our sailors, and our airmen and women who are going to defend democracy in the West. It's not the courts, dare I say it, it's probably not even the press. At the end of the day, it is always our armed forces working with our allies who are best placed to defend our values, our principles, and the things that we stand for. And we just mustn't lose sight of that fact.
No, it's a point well made, John. I'd like to move on more to a bit of foreign policy, particularly with the foreign policy of a Labour government. We're kind of operating on the assumption that it's pretty clear there's going to be a Labour government. All that's really to be decided is its majority. And when I look at in the months ahead, a Labour government settling in, it does strike me it could be quite short of allies, because it could face Donald Trump in the White House. He's currently favourite to win. The National Rally, Madame Le Pen in France, looks like it's going to take over at least a part of the French government. And what could have been Labour's natural allies in Europe, the German Social Democrats, their coalition government is the walking wounded and on the way out. I mean, a Labour government could be short of friends on foreign policy.
Well, I think the international climate is getting more complicated. There's no doubt about that. I think we've got a very capable shadow foreign secretary in David Lammy. I think we will have a very capable. I do. Yes. No. I work very closely with David over many years.
Well, what's his experience or expertise in foreign affairs?
Well, he has been shadow foreign secretary for quite some time, and I think some of our greatest foreign secretaries have come into that role, understood the brief, and done a brilliant job. Yes, it'd be great if we had full-time career diplomats in all of these places. But actually, this is a job that requires a political mindset and a political direction. And I have every confidence in David Lammy, as I've said, Andrew, to be an outstanding foreign secretary.
You wouldn't sleep You wouldn't sleep a little sounder if it was Douglas Alexander at the Foreign Office?
Douglas is a very experienced person, a minister in the Foreign Office and so on. But I think the point you've just very eloquently made for me, Andrew, is that actually the new Prime Minister will have a range of really experienced people to support the diplomatic policy and foreign policy of the next Labour government, should there be one. So I do not see this in terms of, do we have a competent team to take over? I absolutely believe we do. I do agree with you that the foreign policy landscape is getting more complicated, but I don't see it as one where there's absolutely no prospect of making progress. There's no prospect, for example, of keeping the NATO alliance strong and united, particularly in the short term as we face increasing Russian aggression in Europe and their willingness to use force to pursue their foreign policy aims. It is getting more complicated. Should the far right become the government of France, I don't underestimate the challenge, not just for us, but for all democratic nations in Europe, if should that happen. I mean, I think that is clearly going to be a major challenge for whoever forms the next government.
Well, let me stick with Europe for the moment, because one of Mr. Starmer's foreign policy objectives is to get a bit closer to Europe, to buff away the rough edges of the Brexit withdrawal arrangement and so on. But the kind of Europe he was planning to deal with is already changing enormously. You've got Wilders in Holland, Meloni in Italy, probably soon to be Bardella and Le Pen in France. It's even Belgium's going through changes as well. The kind of Europe that he would have found comfortable dealing with, and may even have expected a kind of relatively warm reception, that's not the way Europe's going. He's going to be in trouble, and everything from trying to get some of the benefits of the single market down to any kind of deal on boat people. That's just become much harder.
Yeah, it probably has become harder. That's absolutely true. I'm not underestimating that. The landscape is changing, and it's not changing, in my view and from my perspective, in a very helpful way. But it's not as if we are without allies of any kind at all in Europe. I don't believe that's true. I think Chancellor Scholz, yes, maybe his political position is not as strong as he would like, not as strong as I would like, but he is still in situ as the Chancellor of Germany and in a very strong position to really try and help us move things forward. And I do think on Europe, I mean, it's quite clear that should there be a Labour government, there isn't at this point going to be any fundamental revision of the Brexit arrangements, and that's the democratic will of the British people. That's been resolved, and we've got to move on from that. But I still think there is a prospect of incremental, steady improvements in the relationships with us and the European Union. And I think that'd be a good thing for Britain. I think it'd be a good thing for us in the world and our diplomatic effect. And I think it would be particularly good for us on the economic front, because I think there are and have been some pretty substantial negative impacts from Brexit, particularly if you're a manufacturer, if you're making goods and you're trying to sell them into Europe. We know the effect of Brexit's not been great. So I think there is scope for more work there, and I'm sure the Labour government will get involved with that, should there be one.
All right, let's just skip through a couple of other issues that will probably face an incoming Labour government. Ukraine. Do you think a Starmer government will be prepared to give more military aid, more sophisticated military aid, more long-range military aid to the Ukrainian government?
I hope so. I think we've got to look at those issues really from a very, very sort of committed, serious perspective. We cannot allow the Ukrainians to be defeated in this conflict with Russia. We can't allow that. Consequences for the rest of Europe will be very severe. Consequences for the Ukrainians will be very severe. So I'm quite sure, Andrew, that the next Labour government will maintain the support we give to Ukraine, and will look very seriously at all the issues that you've referred to, because I think it's in our long-term strategic interest that Ukraine is not defeated there. And that's got to be baked in, I think, to any foreign policy approach that a new government might take.
All right, AUKUS. This one of the achievements of the current government, the submarine arrangement involving Australia, America, and the United Kingdom. Is Labour that enthusiastic about that? I mean, Starmer and the people around him are very Eurocentric, and Team Starmer has shown very little interest in the Pacific. Do you think there'll be an enthusiastic supporter of expanding AUKUS? I mean, the Japanese are looking like they might want to join. Do they understand these issues?
No, I think they do, and I think the Labour Party has been supportive of AUKUS and the strategy behind it. And of course, for us in the UK, there's the possibility of some significant economic benefits as well, and not least in my former constituency of Barrow and Furness, where we make Royal Navy submarines.
Of course. No, good news.
So I think I think AUKUS is a given. I think it's actually a fundamental part of our wider strategy of how we engage with our allies, how we support our allies. Conflict is not just prevalent in Europe; it's at risk in the Pacific region as well, and we've got to act in concert with our allies there too. So I don't think that a new Labour government will pose any threat to AUKUS. I'll be solidly behind that.
One final question for you, John. Now, Keir Starmer has brought Labour firmly back into line when it comes to our nuclear deterrent. He's in favour of the nuclear deterrent. He says he would use our nuclear deterrent if he really had to. He will continue with the government's modernisation programme, including 4 new dreadnought submarines. He believes in all that. But are we not right just to be a little bit suspicious of Labour's commitment to our independent deterrent, when it will be a government which will have Angela Rayner, David Lammy, Lisa Nandy, Emily Thornby, they'll all be part of that government. They've never been cheerleaders for Trident.
No, I think that's probably true. There is that sort of opinion within the Labour Party. It's always been there. But if you look at the record of Labour Prime Ministers, right back to Harold Wilson, to Jim Callaghan, to Tony Blair, to Gordon Brown, all Labour Prime Ministers have strongly supported the nuclear deterrent. And I think that's a fundamental test, in my view, of their credibility to govern. And I think Keir Starmer has made his position very clear on that. So on that issue, Andrew, yes, of course, there's a range of opinion. You'd expect that in any political party. Actually, I remember some quite senior Conservatives saying that we shouldn't renew our nuclear deterrent, that it wasn't the right thing to do. The question is our next Prime Minister committed to the nuclear deterrent? I think the answer to that question is clear for everyone to see, and that's what really matters.